Very much. Now I have the great honor of inviting Mr. Gary Mills from Johannesburg, who will. Acha, Dr. Greg Mills, sorry. Dr. Greg Mills from Johannesburg, who will be joining us on line. So over to you, Dr. Mills.
Don't worry, I will. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm sorry not to be there in person. I'm currently in Cape Town in South Africa, so bordering the southern oceans, which indeed border on Pakistan. And Pakistan is very close to my heart, not least because my grandmother was born and married and lived there for a long time. So it's one of the threads that binds me to your part of the world. And not least also that I've spent a lot of time in my career in Afghanistan. And of course, the second most followed game in the world is cricket, at which unfortunately you're a little bit better than us at the moment, it has to be said. I'm going to talk to you about security in Africa. I'm going to be brief. I have a lot of slides, so I'll just go through them very quickly and focus on those that are pertinent to this. But let me just say at the outset, apropos the previous speaker, we currently in Africa are engulfed in various conflicts, mostly civil in nature. And just to put Gaza in perspective as to the challenges that we face, that if 35,000 people have been killed in Gaza, which is more or less the accepted figure out there, since 2020, in the Horn of Africa alone, at least 1.5 million people have lost their lives. So we face insecurity on a completely different scale, often very far from the concerns of the international community, with a fraction of the coverage, despite the enormity of the loss of life. So with that in mind, I'm going to try and do something technological, which my children would be amazed with, which is to share my screen. Can you all see it?
Yes.
You can see it. Fantastic. And I'm going to put it on slideshow, which is even testing my abilities further. Can you see there's that on slideshow now? Good. Okay, I work for the Brenthurst Foundation in South Africa. We focus much of our activity on the African continent. I spent most of my life running around Africa, occasionally outside. And we're interested in best practice and in worst practice because our role is mainly to provide advice to heads of government at their request. So in very simple terms, in crude terms, we're a sort of pro bono McKinsey's, because we don't make them pay for it, because we have a number of wealthy sponsors who see this as a worthy thing to do. If you had to create an African SWOT analysis right now, you would say that our big upside is that we are very poor, and I'll come back to this fact in a moment. That we have a tremendous commodity base. We speak languages which integrate us well with the rest of the globe. We have a long-term democratic trajectory although it's faltering currently, and we have seen the power of technology in terms of mobile markets. If you looked at it in terms of opportunities, we're very young. We have this mass, and I'll refer to all of these factors in a moment. This mass of young people coming into urban areas, which of course creates economies of scale, all sorts of developmental possibilities. The fact that there's low growth elsewhere and aging populations in key markets is an opportunity for us. And there's tremendous demand still for commodities in the international community, which we are blessed with, as well as agricultural produce, which we have tremendous potential in. Our weaknesses are, of course, that we are poor, again. And we are expensive because we're poor and poor because we're expensive. It's a sad axiom. This is a consequence not so much of bad policy, but of very opaque and poor governance. We have very very bad boom and bust cycles in our economy. And in fact, our overall economic structure is very much akin to that of the colonial period. Essentially, one group of incoming people replaced another one that looked a bit like me, but the structure of African economies remained largely extractive. It's just that the elites changed, and they've remained in much the same form and format over the last 60 years. There's lack of value addition as a consequence of this. Our infrastructure remains well below our needs, and our human capital potential is high, but it's entirely dependent on education and often suffers from a loss of skills. Excuse me. Our threats are, of course, our demography, which is burgeoning. Our threat is, too, that our democracy stalls, that we have unresponsive government to these factors. Climate change, of course, is something of a curved ball, or perhaps a googly in cricketing terms, that we can't read properly. It's concerning that donors are distracted elsewhere. That has some advantages, of course, but also has tremendous capital disadvantages. And another potential downside is that AI takes the jobs that enable us to get on the first or the second rung of the developmental ladder. So there's 6 big questions here, which is, how do we get our economic growth up? How do we deal with our demographic challenge, because we're about to double our population over the next generation by the year 2050? How do we cater for the large numbers of urban Africans? How do we use technology to our advantage? How do we ensure that there's a deepening and extension and consolidation of democracy, and that we have institutions fit for purpose? And how do we get outsiders to align with African needs better than they have been able to do hitherto? This is perhaps the most revealing chart of all of the ones I'm going to show you today. This is sub-Saharan Africa, and I've taken an example here of ECOWAS. This is Africa's share of global per capita income. It'd be interesting to do one for South Asia too. In other words, how rich we were and how rich we are compared to independence. At independence, we were roughly the same as Southeast Asia. And today, we have fallen as a share of global per capita income to below 20%. In fact, it's now closer to 15%, whereas Asia is, of course, over 120% on average. And this is because of really low growth, poor governance I alluded to, and of course, massive political instability, particularly in potentially high growth areas of places like the west of Africa, for example, and indeed also East Africa. If you look at this growth map as a coloration, the high growth areas are above 5%. It's a very patchy growth picture. Most of them are rather insipid, below 3%. My own country, South Africa, has virtually no growth currently. Our last quarter, I think we had 0.2% of growth. We really are in a state of paralysis. And much of that is down to very poor governance. If you look at this growth chart as a comparative perspective, there's 3 periods of African economic activity. There's the 60s, where some redistribution from colonial powers to indigenous peoples occurred. You saw a slight uptick in growth in per capita terms, then a long period of decline down to the 1990s, and a very slow rise again. And this indicates another truism, my second truism, which is that the period of recovery is at least as long as the period of decline when it comes to African economic performance. And this is a consequence of that, is while the rest of the world has been able to reduce poverty levels enormously, particularly in East Asia, and especially in China, generally sub-Saharan Africa is now has the largest store of poor people in the world, around about just over 400 million. And in fact, if we'd just been able to grow our economies at the same rate of Asia, we would be significantly wealthier than the global average by comparison. And what this really means is that the business as usual approach to African economic development offers no solutions. So the march of demography is that we're going to double our populations. Some areas are going to be even more spectacular, particularly in the Sahel, in places like Niger and Mali, Burkina Faso, which are already wrought with political instability. There's a tremendous opportunity here through a demographic dividend, but demographic dividend only works if you really put the conditions in place to be able to use the surge of young people in your economy properly, and that surge, as they come into the job market, is simultaneously accompanied by a reduction in birth rates. That's at least what Asia teaches us. So we're going to add nearly 600 million people to the global workforce and be home to the largest and youngest population globally. And if you look at the rate of change, we're a green continent. And blue continent, where the rest of the world is much of it is coloured in greys and in browns. The working population, and you will have a copy of this presentation should you want it, so you don't have to focus too much on the figures. As I've said, this means we have the surge of young people, working age people coming into our economy simultaneously. And this is going to have a big impact on African cities. We're going to see the emergence of several megacities, but particularly in this band of cities between what are currently between 1 million to 2 million and 10 million is going to grow enormously over the next 25 years. As I said, this creates tremendous opportunities, but absent the sort of attentive government, it creates all sorts of possibilities for instability within these city environments. Traditionally, African cities have much higher rates of growth and are wealthier. That is good news in many respects. It reflects the economies of scale present in this, but also is a portent potentially of insecurity and of greater city flows, migration to the cities, if the rural areas continue to suffer from very low rates of growth. There has been a good news story in Africa over the last several decades in terms of democratic change, not just demographic change. Like the rest of the world, we've seen a tremendous upliftment in the regimes described as free or partly free since the 1990s. This has tailed off somewhat with a spate of new coups across Africa in recent times. There were just 2 African democracies as measured by Freedom House in 1980. Today, there's currently more or less about 10 at any given moment, as described in the partly free category. This, of course, has tailed off a little bit, but it's in the free category. In the partly free category, there's about 25 countries routinely in that kind of middle ground. Whether we consolidate their position or not is, of course, dependent on how government responds to electoral challenges in part, and how citizens take up the cultures. That's the global picture, and that is the African picture. A very considerable chunk still not free. And again, if you want to use a different measurement, the red is indicative of authoritarian regimes, and a large part of the continent is painted red. We in South Africa, of course, are having our probably most important election since 1994, 30 years since the end of apartheid, on the 29th of May. So everyone here is thinking about democracy virtually 24/7, or being told to think about democracy 24/7. It doesn't mean that we are by any means aligned with global standards in terms of governance performance. Generally, governance follows democracy in Africa. The better governed are more democratic, better systems of rule of law, for instance. And as a consequence of that, the African average is well below the global average in a whole range of measures. And we've seen a rise more recently in coups, particularly in that belt of the Sahel, all the way from Sudan to Guinea-Bissau, but particularly in the Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger area. in recent times, which has given rise to a threat of a new coup era in Africa, one that also has a geopolitical dimension given the involvement of Russia in supporting some of these putschists. And this is really counter to what the majority of Africans want. A group called Afrobarometer has done excellent work over the last 20 years in surveying African views about democracy, and more than 2/3 of Africans routinely prefer democracy, but only 7% of Africans actually live in fully democratic regimes. 93% of Africans live under a form of authoritarianism. And as I've said, there's a better result from democracy in Africa, but it's just that Africans are not being given democracy in the manner that they wanted. Africa is also in something of a debt bind at the moment. I'm not going to go into this in any great length. This is partly a result of too low growth, partly a result of massive new borrowings from China, which has been the largest lender to Africa. It's not been a donor, it's been a lender. And there's a very big difference. Money is never free. Eventually you run out of somebody else's money, or you have to start paying it back. And we've had to start paying it back. And as a consequence of this, government debt to GDP ratios have risen enormously. Most African youth who are polled tend to see the world in very negative terms, see very negative things in their future, don't have hope for their future. And this is very different, of course, to the picture 60 years ago. So we're rich in demography, we're very poor in democracy, and we're very weak in governance. And this gives rise to these three issues. We have very little consensus about how to go about or identify what the problem is and what to do. But there is this link between democracy, governance, and growth, but yet we don't pursue the consolidation of that process. And clearly the rise of authoritarianism poses a strategic threat to most Africans who want a different type of system. But in all of this, we see the world in very different ways. The donors see the world in a different way. They see money in part as a solution, but they also prefer to use it to maintain strategic interests. Africans tend to see the problem in financial terms, hence the call for a Marshall Plan. Academics are caught typically between seeing the world in completely different ways. So some see aid as the problem, some see technical solutions as the solution, but in fact you need much more cross-cutting strategic solutions. And we don't seem to have a degree of consensus among the academic or analytical community. The business community likes to have big men who get things done. But of course, the record in Africa is that big men are even worse. Authoritarians are even worse than democratic outcomes. And NGOs, bless them, they like aid as the solution, not least because they benefit from that. We've also learned, and I'm not going to go through this in any depth, that geography is not an excuse. We tend to be prisoners of our past when it comes to colonialism. Climate or religion is not really a consistent excuse. The cultural argument doesn't really work. What we do need to do is to get institutions to do their job properly. We need to align outsiders to the way in which we go about things. Policy is important. Governance is even more important. Local ownership is absolutely imperative. And you need stamina. You need to do this for a very long time over many generations to make a development difference. And this is why, if you look at all those factors, the poorest 15 countries in the world are in fact not one thing.
They're very
different things.
You have 2 minutes to wind up.
No problem. So we have these problems which I've already gone through. Coups are back, growth is faltering, demography is marching on, Western donors appearing to be turning inward, democracy is retreating. The Russians are here, and they're likely not to solve these problems, but in a sense to compound the very underpinning factors. We know that weapons and money are not sufficient in solving African insecurity. Afghanistan teaches exactly that money and weapons are not sufficient. Iraq teaches us that too. You need to understand state strength in very different ways in terms of the inner stuffings. And this is why they can sometimes appear strong on the surface, but weak on the inside. And this is why democratic processes are so important to Africa. This is why meritocracy and institution building is so important. And this is why individuals and personalities and leadership is so important. Let me go right to the end and the last couple of slides, if I may, in a minute, and say our usual challenges are these things down here, that we have weak states, that we have the politics of exclusion, that we have extractive systems, that we have low growth, and we have a whole series in addition to this right now of fresh challenges. We've seen the return of debt. We've seen increased problems, particularly in the Sahel from climate change. We've seen terrorism re-emerge. We've seen youth and citizen empowerment as a political force rear its head. We've seen systemic, generational inequality as a fixed feature of Africa. And we've, of course, seen what we in South Africa call state capture, that the elites capture the state as a source of continuous revenue, and this leads to endemic trust and mistrust issues and skills migration and all of the above. And the usual solutions that we posit for all of this is that we need better governance. Well, that's fine, but how do you get it? That we need better partnerships. Well, that's fine, but how do you do that? That we need local lead ownership of the problem as well as the solution. Well, that's again fine, but how do you get there? We need better terms of trade, and so on and so forth. We need all these things, but none of them ever really seem to happen. And there's a fresh approach to all of this, is that one has to drive much more evidence-based practices. You need a different political leadership, which is driven by a much more positive narrative. You need the emergence of a meritocratic system, which is led by that personality-driven leadership, prioritization, the need of for priorities to be set also at a continental and at a subcontinental level. And then you need external engagement predicated on legitimacy, carefully calibrated on this metric, that you don't have external agencies simply going in and reinforcing illegitimate governments in the eyes of their people. So I'm trying to capture that we sit at a particular junction, which is precisely the outcome of which is precisely why we have these staggering, enormous casualties of war currently ongoing in places like Ethiopia and in Sudan, of a scale that actually almost or does shade everything else in the rest of the world. And yet, this is not a priority for the international community. It hasn't captured the imagination and certainly demands a different approach, a fresh approach to security in Africa, which has to be led by Africans themselves. Thank you very much.